We have also seen a difference in terms of the level of involvement of the private sector from Denmark and Africa, and I'll focus primarily on Kenya. Definitely, we are seeing more involvement of the private sector from Denmark in Africa. And I can just give one example, for instance. If one was to look at the logistics involvement or investment in Kenya, your company here, Maersk, actually handles about 30 to 40% of all our imports in terms of the logistics as a country. And about 50% of our exports are actually in the hands of Maersk. They do the shipping. So that is a very critical engagement that we have. And I was joking earlier with, I think the ambassador, and I was saying if Maersk went on holiday for a few days or a month for that matter, then you can imagine what it would do to critical raw materials that are required in Kenya and what it would do to our exports. So there is indeed a significant difference, a significant improvement between the level of engagement 15 years ago and today. Thank you.
Okay. And I'll ask you the same question, Lars Løkke Rasmussen. How has Europe and Denmark's perspective on Africa changed from your perspective the past, let's say, decade?
Well, basically it was all the dimensions mentioned in the Prime Minister's speech, and no reason to repeat all of that. But honestly speaking, I think among other things, it was an eye-opener when we had this Russian full-fledged illegal invasion in Ukraine, and we turned to our African friends who have a past have been colonized and should be the very first to emphasize the need for everybody to uphold the UN Charter, etc. And we saw that many of them actually abstained. I think that was a true eye-opener for many, many, many people in Western Europe. And is, among other things, a reason for a stronger engagement. Not to solve the Ukrainian war, but because it proves a point that we haven't engaged enough on an equal platform. And I think one important thing, even though it's pretty banal, is the fact that we shouldn't look at Africa as Africa. We have this very famous Danish child song, Africa, Africa. Yeah, and it goes like, Africa, the country all kids know. And you know, Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent which consists of 54 different countries. And they are not on an equal footing. I mean, some of them are prosperous countries, as Kenya is an anchor of stability in the region. Others are facing severe security problems and problems when it comes to democracy, etc., the whole Sahel region. So a part of this is looking at the continent Africa in a much more nuanced way. And if you do that, you will realize that there is also, from a business perspective, huge potential in some countries and perhaps not in others. And that's why we need this more holistic approach, which is the core idea behind this new strategy. Many other reasons as well. I will try to be brief, but look at the demographic. I mean, when 1/4 of the total population on this earth will be an African in 2050, and 1/3 of all youngsters, and we are talking about a continent close to our continent, like 14 kilometers, I mean, then there's no doubt that we will be witnessing lots of Africans on our continent in like 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. We just have to decide in what capacity do we want to welcome them. as partners, business partners, students, or as, for instance, climate refugees. So it is in the interest of humanity, but it's also in our own pure interest from a security point of view that we engage in Africa.
And Dr. Mudavadi, as the foreign minister just mentioned, Africa is probably one of the most diverse continent in the world. 54 countries, as he just mentioned, with completely different economies, with completely different cultures. I think 2,000 different languages are being spoken. Yet the West often tends to talk about Africa as a whole. Do you feel that the West lacks nuance in its perspective on Africa? And if so, is that not a problem in terms of creating an equal partnership?
Well, there are quite a number of issues that arise. Your first question was whether we've seen a difference in engagement. The truth is, yes, there has been a difference in engagement. Now, what is the nature of this engagement? What is the structure of this engagement? Becomes the very important issue that my colleague, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, is raising here. Because the question is this engagement having the necessary impact? Is it just growing in terms of numbers but skewed towards one part of the globe, that is the Europe or Denmark for that matter, or is it also having that impact that it should have on the African continent? For instance, Kenya has just finished the agreement, the EPA, European Partnership, Economic Partnership Agreement. The first for us, the first perhaps in Africa, if I'm not too wrong. Now the question is, can we then move to the phase of proper implementation? And we appreciate that this is a milestone because the EU Parliament has endorsed this agreement with an overwhelming majority, but can we now implement it? Can we see the benefits of that agreement? Because if you look at the trade numbers, they're still very grim comparatively to what comes to Europe and what the African continent gets in terms of their trade balances. So there is an issue there, and I think with this strategy, if it's going to yield a structure of engagement that has even greater impact in the livelihoods and helping the African countries get out of poverty and crisis, then it will make a lot of sense. And therefore it's an initiative that needs to be looked at and anchored. For instance, if we were to talk about the WTO, what can the European Union, what can Denmark do to help Africa as a continent navigate some of the extremely stringent and difficult regulations within the WTO? So we may be doing something here with the European Union, but then the broader WTO engagement of trade and involvement becomes a big challenge. The other thing that I would quickly just again pick up is Africa is also facing challenges. The geopolitics globally, and again there's the mention of the Ukraine challenge, we have the Gaza and so forth. I was trying to pick some details out of the what you'd call just some statistical data. What, for instance, in the last few years has the US Congress set aside to deal with issues of conflict and war, and how much has actually gone to actual intervention when it comes to poverty alleviation or trade or serious programs. And the figures are scary. It shows that these conflicts, these global conflicts, are sucking the resources away from the targeted areas, which would make a very big difference, whether in education, health, or food security. The conflicts are sucking the resources out of everybody. And therefore, one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is, strategy that we're putting in place be structured so that we can get more resources going to actual production as opposed to conflict.